Hi there, this is Nikki Hibbets from The Ruffled Purse, which you can find at theruffledpurse.com, where it is my goal to support, empower, and inspire busy people to discover the joy of sewing and make time to do it. This video tutorial is a portion of a larger tutorial which you can find on my website, theruffledpurse.com. The link is in the description. For this quilt as you go technique that I am going to show you, you are going to need to prepare your quilt blocks first. That means that you are going to piece together the quilt blocks, you are going to make your quilt sandwich, baste them together, and then quilt them. After that, you're going to trim each block so that it is the finished size. To connect your quilt blocks together, you are going to need what I call connectors. Connectors are skinny strips of fabric that are cut 1 1/8 inches wide by the width of the fabric. The connectors are going to be used to connect the quilt blocks together. Blocks are going to be connected into rows first. To make the rows, each quilt block is going to need 2 connectors, except for the blocks at the end of each row. Those will only need 1. These connectors are going to be the height of the quilt block. Once you have the rows made, you are going to then connect those together. You're going to need 2 connectors for each row, except for the top row and the bottom row, where you're going to need just 1. Depending on how long your rows are, you may need to sew 2 connectors together in order to make the connector long enough. When you are sewing 2 quilt blocks together, you need 2 connectors. One connector is going to go on the top edge of the first block. The second connector is going to go on the bottom edge of the quilt block right next to it. And you are going to put right sides together. When you sew the connector to the quilt block, you're going to make sure that the top edge of the connector is lined up with the top edge of the quilt block. It's lined up, the raw edges are lined up right here along the side. You're going to use a 1/4 inch presser foot to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you are going to sew. Once you're done sewing the connectors on, check the bottom. If you have a little bit of connector hanging off, you want to go ahead and trim that down to the edge of your quilt block. Once your connectors are sewn on, you're ready to sew the 2 quilt blocks together. You're going to change your foot so you can do a zigzag stitch. You're going to set your machine to a zigzag stitch, and then you're going to adjust the length and width. For my machine, I'm going to use a length of 2, and then my zigzag is going to be a 5. You need to make sure that the zigzag width is going to go across the opening, the edge where the 2 meet, but it stays inside the 2 seam allowances. When you are inserting your 2 blocks underneath the presser foot, you're going to make sure that the top edges are lined up. You're going to center that seam where they meet, and then you're going to zigzag. You're going to go down just a couple of inches. Then you're going to check and see what it looks like at the end of the block. What you're looking for is to make sure that the bottom edge is also going to be lined up. You might need to pull a little bit on one side or the other to make sure that everything stays lined up. So as you are sewing, that is what you're paying attention to. Not only is the zigzag going across the place where the 2 blocks meet, but also that bottom edge is going to stay lined up. The next step is to press to set the stitches, and then you are going to press the connector on the back open first. And this is going to be if you're going to machine sew the raw, turn and machine sew those raw edges down. So we're going to go ahead and, like I said, just press this connector on the back
so it lays flat. And then you are going to turn the raw edge so that it is just covering that stitch line on the other quilt block. And you are just going to turn and press all the way down. And actually, whether you're going to machine sew or hand sew the connectors down, this side of the connectors down, this is what you're going to do. So with this side prepared, if you're going to machine sew it, you're going to take it to your machine, making sure that turned edge stays under, and then you are going to sew very close to this edge right here. When you do that, it is going to be right along or just inside this stitch line here, so it will not be visible from the front. If you're going to sew the connectors down by machine on this second edge that we just turned under, then you want to get as close to the edge as you can so that it is very close to this seam line that's sewed on the connector on the other side. I went ahead, and even though I pressed this edge, this raw edge down, I went ahead and put some pins in place because it kept popping up, but I want to make sure it lays flat. And again, you're just going to sew as close to that edge as you can get. I did move my needle over just a little bit to the right, and I'm just going to adjust that stitch length just a bit. Okay, so here you can see the stitch line that I just did. It's pretty close to the edge of that connector. And again, this is the back side. On the front side, you can see here I did a pretty good job. In fact, in some places I actually got right on top of the stitch line, but then as I kind of came down here, I wasn't quite on top of it, but I can still close the front and prepare it the way that I need to. So just like on the back side, when I'm preparing the connector here, I've already set those stitches from before, and then I'm just going to press this up. Once it's pressed, I'm going to go ahead and turn the raw edge so again it covers that, just is over the original stitch line on the other quilt block. I'm going to go ahead and add some pins to secure it in place, and then I am going to again sew right down as close to the edge as I can get. The challenge here is I want to make sure that I stay within the distance so that I end up on this connector on the back and not over here on my backing fabric. I am using white thread in both my bobbin and my top thread. If I was super concerned about getting over here on the backing fabric, I could change the bobbin thread to be black. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and pin this in place and then sew right along that edge with my sewing machine.
Now that you know how to attach the connectors to connect the blocks to each other, you will continue to do this until you have created all of the rows. Once you have the rows created, it is going to be time to connect those rows together. The technique is going to be the same for connecting the rows as you used for the blocks. The main difference is going to be the length of the connector strips. Those strips need to be as long as the rows. You're going to use two connectors. One is going to be attached to the top of one row. The other is going to be attached to the bottom row, just like on the quilt blocks. You'll have right sides together, and then you'll make sure that you have the edges, the raw edges, lined up. In order to make sure that the connectors for each row are lined up with each other and creating straight columns, you want to make marks at each intersection. This will allow you to make slight adjustments as you sew the row together and ensure that those block connectors are lined up. It is a good idea to pin down the connector that is on the back. You're not going to be able to see it when you sew, and there is a good chance that it is going to get folded up and caught up in your seam allowance. So pinning it down is going to make it less likely to happen. Once you have your row connectors in place, once again, it is going to be the same process that you use to connect the blocks. You're going to use that 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach both of those connectors. Then you're going to connect those rows with a zigzag stitch. You'll press those connectors open, turn the raw edges, and then stitch them in place either with a hand stitch or with your sewing machine. Once you have all of your rows connected, you are just about done. The last step is going to be to attach your binding using your favorite method. And then that's it. You are done. You have quickly created a wonderful quilt using this simple and easy quilt as you go technique. The main purpose of this video was to show you how the connectors are used to attach the quilt blocks and then the rows. If you want to see more information on preparing the quilt blocks and the connectors, in addition to some options that you can use this quilt as you go technique with, you want to check out the related blog post on my website, theruffledpurse.com. The link is in the description.